Hello and welcome. I am Uday Bhaskar and you are watching Security Scan. This week, the spotlight is on the surgical strikes carried out by the Indian Army against terror launch pads along the line of control with Pakistan. In a rare press briefing, the DGMO of the Indian Army informed the media on September 29th that based on credible information, surgical strikes had been carried out on terror launch pads across a 200-kilometer arc to preempt attacks in Jammu and Kashmir and other metros. Lieutenant General Ranbir Singh, the DGMO, further added that significant casualties had been inflicted during this counter-terror operation. This surgical strike comes 10 days after the terror attack on the Uri army camp, which had resulted in the death of 18 Indian soldiers. At the time, Prime Minister Modi assured the country that this dastardly act would not go unpunished. After adopting a posture of extreme restraint in the face of repeated provocation by Pakistan, it appears that India has now decided to take a more assertive and proactive action against terrorism. What does this mean in the long run as far as India's approach to the challenge of state-sponsored terrorism and the bilateral relationship with Pakistan are concerned? And by extension, what of the security dynamic in the southern Asian region, where China is a major determinant? To discuss this, we have, as always, a very eminent panel. Ms. Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor of The Hindu. Major General Bhupesh Jain, retired, senior general officer of the Indian Army and a combat veteran. And Professor Ravi Narayanan from the JNU, an astute China watcher. Ravi, would that be correct to introduce you?
Yes, sir.
Let me first turn to you, Suhasini. We talk about this particular counter-terror operation as representing a major punctuation as far as India's counter-terror policy is concerned. So that's one issue. And concurrently, what is happening in Pakistan, particularly the fact that they completely deny that this operation took place at all. So from your perch, how would you look at this?
I think to answer your second question first, we're in a truly interesting situation where India is saying it has crossed the line of control. India is saying that we have crossed that line that the UN reportedly monitors and gone into territory that is controlled by Pakistan, that India claims. And that Pakistan is saying, no, you haven't. So we're in a particularly interesting point. Where that comes from is, as you said, a point of punctuation. This is an inflection point. And I think by the announcement the government has made, because remember, we have heard of certain covert operations happen in the past. We've heard of certain operations where in 2014, for example, the former army chief actually came out with a press conference and said, Uri has been avenged. He was referring at that time to the beheadings of Indian soldiers. So the real big difference that we have seen, as you said, is this press conference for the Indian government to come out and say, yes, we have done it. It's a mental barrier. So the first message, if you ask me, that has changed is the message that the government is willing to send domestically. Domestically, they are saying terror matters enough to us for us to take action and show that we have taken action regardless of the consequences.
Political ownership, would that be a reasonable
I think that's absolutely, it's a political ownership of it, which perhaps in the old days would have been left simply to the army to sort out. The second part of it is in the region. I think it's a huge inflection point that every member of the SAARC, minus Pakistan, has written in, first condemning the Uri attack, then has more or less supported India's position of pulling out of the SAARC, and said in each of their statements that terror, especially cross-border terrorism, is unacceptable. So it's an inflection point of unity inside the SAARC minus Pakistan, and I think we'll see more of that in the next couple of weeks. And the third is the international message to the rest of the world, whether it is China, whether it is Russia, whether it is the US, whether it's the United Nations. India has essentially said, we have done what we wanted to do. If you want to respond, you respond. but we're not changing.
So there's a very clear thing. We'll come back to the diplomatic aspect, but Bhupesh, if I can ask you to come in on this with your experience in the Indian Army, could you just share your thoughts about the operation itself to the extent that you can, and also maybe what do you make of the Pakistani denial?
As far as tactical details of the operations is concerned, as has been the want of special forces, we would rather it remains a mystery, because that part deals with TTP, tactics, techniques and procedures, and we would not want it to be discussed. I do not think Indian Army was very happy being with the identification of the units. But then, you know, in a democracy and in open democracy like ours, you have to accept certain things. So I don't think the tactical details really matter so much. I would rather focus on your second part of the question as to what is exactly why and what of Pakistan's activity. So as I have explained earlier also, Pakistan has in the past, if you see, always initially tried to deny whenever any such thing happened. If you recollect, when last time even Osama incident took place, their first reaction was no, nothing of that sort happened. So they've tried to do that, and the reasons for doing that is the security, the deep state of Pakistan always believes and wants to put across the message that they are in control and nothing happens there without their permission. And if you recollect, even then they somehow put out a message that there was some kind of understanding which was reached between the Pakistan army and Americans when this happened. They neither accepted it nor denied it.
That's Bin Laden.
That's Bin Laden's case. Now, you look at this particular scenario that it had happened with in our case. The first thing is, their first reaction was to deny it, while as the Prime Minister accepted it. So there was a difference there. He also has to deny it because he wants to impress his people who do not watch your TV channels or read the newspapers. They only get to hear what Pakistan media puts out, and which is what Pakistan Army wants it. They also wanted to put out this message of denial because Rahil Sharif is going to retire. He doesn't want to retire with the egg on his face.
This is the Pakistani Army Chief General Rahil Sharif, who retires in the end of November.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you look at the last thing, it's been put out in the media that Pakistan Army Chief wants an extension. And it makes his job very, very difficult, because that now gives an opportunity to the Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif for questioning him for his failures. So these are very many reasons why I believe
they may have. But maybe I'll take the liberty of answering my own question, the first one, and say that as far as this operation is concerned, from everything that we have seen in the media, I think the Indian Army is to be commended for carrying out such a swift, clean operation, but I'll leave it at that. Ravi, can I turn to you? It's the China factor, which is that Suhasini pointed out that almost all the major powers, without exception, were empathetic to India post-Uri and subsequently when this counter-terrorism operation took place. But we find that in many ways, China is the odd man out. And this is now substantiated in the position they have taken in relation to Masood Azhar, where they have placed the entire issue again on technical hold, though he is, quote unquote, a proclaimed terrorist as far as India is concerned. So what do you make of China's position?
So China has multiple positions when it comes to the issue of terrorism. Number one, they consider terrorism to be a domestic issue back home. At multilateral forums like the United Nations, China speaks in a very different voice, and which would almost sound pious and sanctimonious, where it condemns terrorism and the ideologies that terrorism has fostered, and which needs to be, in double quotes, destroyed. China has also lent its credibility on defining terrorism through resolutions passed in the United Nations, including 2309, passed on 21st September, where it lent weight to the aspect that terrorism needs to be quarantined and needs to be eliminated, and which requires global cooperation. At home, China has tried to isolate terrorism by identifying it with a particular ethnicity, in this case the Uyghurs. When it comes to not issuing a statement regarding what happened in Uri, that is typical of Chinese foreign policy, where they wait and watch, and as long as the problem doesn't hit home, I do not expect China to issue a statement on what they would term as an isolated incident. What catches my attention, however, is the fact that at one level, terrorism is very important to Chinese leadership, because embedded within the Chinese decision-making infrastructure are the leading study groups, a party mechanism, and there is a leading study group on counter-terrorism set up in 2012. Now, what we need to impress upon the Chinese is to restart our conversation with the Chinese on counter-terrorism and link it up to what the leading study group has been talking about and deciding.
You know, on this, Ravi, I gather that China watches this channel fairly closely. So you use the word sanctimonious. I do not have that expertise. I hope we can find the right equivalent in Chinese for sanctimonious. But I want to bounce that to you, Suhasini. China's position on terrorism, I would say over the last decade plus, what do you ascribe their empathy to? Meaning that why are they so sympathetic to Pakistan despite the fact that there is a global concern about terror? Everyone has, in a way acknowledged Pakistan's role. What do you make of it?
When we talk about China today sympathizing with Pakistan, the truth is it is easy to forget that China was actually the most cooperative with India when it came to in fact designating these groups post 2001. When the 1267 Taliban Sanctions Committee was originally set up, at that time it was Al-Qaeda Taliban. Now it's Al-Qaeda, I think IS is included in it. China actually co-sponsored some of India's demands and also backed India. And I'll give you on specific, the banning of Jaish-e-Mohammed, the banning of Lashkar-e-Toiba, the prescription against Hafiz Saeed that followed, and especially with the Mumbai attacks. In all of those cases, we saw China actually backing India. I've actually looked at all the places where India has put in for these, for notifying these entities as terrorists according to the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, Taliban Sanctions Committee, and actually found that from 2014 onwards, there's been a toughening in China's position. And since 2014, China has actually blocked India on 5 occasions. Not just on specifically in this case where they've put a technical hold on Masood Azhar's designation as a terrorist, even though it should be an absolute no-brainer when you think of the fact that what were the circumstances under which Masood Azhar was released from India, where he was being held as a terrorist. He was released as a ransom. As
part of the hijacking.
As a part of the hijacking. So there should be no question in anyone's mind who exactly this man is. But even so, we have seen China block India on 5 occasions, whether it has been Masood Azhar, whether it has been Sayyid Salahuddin, who India tried to have proscribed, must be days after Prime Minister Modi had gone to Beijing.
So this is post-2014?
Post-2014, we've seen a hardening in their position.
But what do you think? Well, what's the reason for
I think it requires to see where the India-China relationship has been going. And I think post-2014, post-India's announcement of its coming closer to America, there's been a hardening on the Chinese position. And we saw that particularly even when it came to something small like, relatively smaller, instead of the prescription, it was Zakiur Rahman Lakhvi, who under the Taliban Sanctions Committee should not get recourse to funds. And yet we saw him get the bail in a Pakistani court and get bail money as well.
So then would it be fair to infer that China is really using this as a leverage in terms of both the India-China bilateral relationship and the larger triangular with the United States?
I think what China is essentially saying to India is a bilateral message here. What they're doing by blocking Masood Azhar is essentially saying, make this good for us, make this deal good for us. And it's up to India whether they wish to do that or not. For the last 2 years, we've certainly seen a dip in India-China relations.
General Jain, again, to take this China part forward in terms of what does it mean for India, meaning what next? That's how we have titled this program, saying that after India's counter-terror operation, the response from Pakistan, as also the response from China in the diplomatic context. The operational challenges for India. We just had Baramulla, where a BSF Jawan lost his life. So what is the pattern that you are likely to see? And I'm only asking you to talk about this in probability, not as a prediction. But what do you think will be the operational challenge in the weeks and months ahead?
I get it. I get it. Look, the in international relations, when you look at purely as a professional, I do not see Pakistan army or the groups which have been created by the deep state of Pakistan, or for that matter in China, or whether they have been part of Chinese, or we are assuming they are part of Chinese official support. Countries do not give up such policies just because one particular strike resulted in a response or a surgical strike. So I think maybe they will go back to the drawing boards, recalculate, carry out recalibration, and usual services will resume in due course of time. So I do not see any change to that.
Pakistan's orientation.
Pakistan's group, deep state of Pakistan, Pakistan army, as far as the political leadership of Pakistan, everybody included, this will continue as hitherto. That's my assessment. Therefore, as far as India is concerned, what is the lessons that you draw out of it? As far as India is concerned, what you have done once in terms of surgical strike has to be carried forward. How do you carry it forward? By creating capabilities, by creating organizational structures. So, number of people have written, there is a need for us to integrate special forces, make them joint, Army, Air Force, Navy, integrate them with intelligence establishments, create, you look at USA, they have Title 10 special forces, they have Title 50 special forces. Title 50 special forces operate under CIA, Title 10 operates under joint forces. So you can create special forces which under.
So we need a certain rationalization of existing capabilities.
Create capability, demonstrate them, they act as deterrent.
And this, by the way, as you rightly said, even after the Kargil War of 1999 and subsequently after Mumbai in 2008, I know from personal shall we say exposure, that there are enough inputs to the government of India about the need for a certain degree of rationalization of existing assets. But we'll come back to that. Ravi, I want to loop you into this one. We are now preparing for the BRICS summit in Goa. And we have, as I said, the principal countries in terms of, apart from India, Russia, China, as also Brazil. How do you think China is going to look at this? Because Russia has its own concern about terrorism. I am sure India is going to bring this up to say that, this is a challenge that we have faced and this is how we've gone about it. So if you can just sort of give us a sense about, and why I'm raising this is that you spent years in Taiwan and you had a little insight into the kind of thinking that animates, shall we say, that part of the world, East Asia. So how do you read China? What is it going to say in Goa about this issue of terrorism?
I think China will use the same methodology they have adopted when it comes to the United Nations, when it comes to a stage where terrorism needs to be defined. By defining terrorism legally, you put in place mechanisms that would address this problem at its very root, where the UN has surprisingly fallen short of, primarily because it was bypassed in very many ways. That is at one level. China, also to deflect attention, would introduce this aspect of cyber security at the BRICS forum, because cyber security is an aspect where India is keen to have some kind of an understanding with the other members of the BRICS. Now, this is another aspect which the two countries need to focus on. If we only stick to terrorism, then we would be on a slightly sticky wicket because of the extreme reluctance on the part of countries like Brazil, South Africa, and China to actually arrive at a coordinated position. And also, it's an argument which some people have said that BRICS fine, but where's the motor? Because if the BRICS is visualizing itself as a trading arrangement, I guess the main, that would be the main agenda. The focus would be on that, especially at a time when the world is still to recover from what has happened in 2008.
Suhasini, you'd agree with that, saying that BRICS will not look at terrorism, or?
No, I do think BRICS has in the past looked at political statements. And if you remember at the BRICS summit in Fortaleza, the eventual statement not only looked at terror, it also looked at the Palestinian cause, which was quite a surprise for people at the time. However, I do agree that finally, if you're going to look at these 5 countries at a time like this when there are such sharp differences. Remember, China will want some kind of a statement of support over the South China Sea, which India is not going to give them. I think in all of this there will be there will be only the trade issues and the economic issues that will perhaps see a greater amount of movement rather than the political issues, because let's face it, we're at a time where India and China are not seeing eye to eye. That may change, however.
But can I just push this a little further and say that BRICS is fine? But what about the SCO, given the fact that China is one of the principal movers there and terrorism is a big deal? I mean, how do you see that?
It's one of those things where I'm not sure it was completely thought through when India originally said, you know, there was a sense that we should be a member of any club that will have us. But now I think India needs to think about whether the SCO is in fact something that fits in, because part of the SCO's charter is almost having exercises with all the other SCO members, doing anti-terror operations together with SCO members. If India and Pakistan join at the same time, as seems to be the plan, it seems difficult to see how that will go through, and whether the charter of the SCO will change or whether somehow it just won't fit our needs.
Because some harmonization. But Bhupesh, can I come to you on this, which is that you served in the US, and you're more than familiar with the United States and its approach to terrorism. When we talk about the South Asian experience, particularly Pakistan, now again, post India's September 28, 29 initiative, what is your reading of the United States and how it's going to deal with this? Because increasingly, we're also coming into a cusp where there'll be a new president in the White House come January. So US policy to terrorism, Pakistan, what's your read on that?
Look, as long as Pakistan was coordinating with the USA, it was a different ballgame, and I don't think I need to go to this esteemed panel in the history onto that. But currently, as of now, there is huge amount of frustration in United States of America with Pakistan and its conduct. One. Second, even when Bombay happened or Mumbai happened, the wondering in America was, why didn't India react? And their argument was, you keep coming back to us, but why don't you do something on our own to strengthen our hand? So, well, that's the argument I heard too many times. I really don't know it was an official position or not, but I of course heard it from fairly senior positions.
So now that India has taken the step, perhaps they would review and recalibrate the entire situation. Ravi, a quick input from you. What about China and India's action on 28-29? Do you think they would be looking at this with some focused
interest? They would be at one level, but Chinese media commentaries have still not appeared on this particular episode, because what is happening is there has been a media overkill from our side and absolute denial on the other side. The casualty here happens to be the truth. And if China was to comment on this episode, it would be very unlikely, because that would mean they have to take a very predicated position on the issue, the event, and the ramifications thereupon.
And which is not in keeping with their general, shall we say, diplomatic posture.
Yes.
So anyway, the surgical strikes mounted by India on September 28th have many distinctive characteristics about them. The most important being the public disclosure and the political ownership asserted by the Modi government. This marks a departure from the earlier pattern where such counter-terror and retaliatory operations along the line of control were kept opaque and below the media radar. What next is a complex question. Much depends on how Rawalpindi, the GHQ of the Pakistan Army, chooses to respond to September 28th. At the moment, Pakistan is denying the Indian narrative and has described the Indian action as routine cross-border firing. But the Baramulla attack suggests that such incidents or more determined Fidayeen type of terror strikes may be attempted. The fact that there is some contact between the two national security advisors is to be cautiously welcomed. However, with the traditional festival season unfolding, civil society needs to be as alert as the security agencies to preempt any acts of terror, sponsored or otherwise, which is what the Indian Army and the political apex demonstrated so commendably on September 28th. On that note, let me thank our guests, Suhasini, Bhupesh, and Ravi.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Security Scan.